This talk is called Mastering Message Queues. My name is Tobias, and here's my Twitter handle. So if you want to attack me online for the next 45 minutes, I can defend myself. Queues. A queue is a simple data structure. Another simple data structure is a stack. This is an example of a stack. It has a top and a bottom, and you put things on it, and you take things from top, like a stack of plates. A queue is very similar. It has a back and a front. You put things on the back and take things out of the front. This is the data structure of a queue. I believe that most of you know this by heart. Yes? Excellent. And you know queues are cheap. There's order one. You can add and remove things in constant speed pretty much. So I'm not going to talk about data structures. This is the most, I'm not going to talk about data structure anymore. I'm going to talk about how I made applications in the past and how I make applications now. And this is not going to be like a journey in time. It's more going to be like a journey in my experience or maturity. And the end goal will obviously be that you will build small applications that you can scale up and down and that you never ever have to update. Seems fair? Was this what you were expecting? Kind of. This is the very first time I'm doing this talk. So I might be some beginner's quirks, or maybe slides that are not in order, or I may have bugs on my slides. If you find a bug on my slide, please write something on JoinedIn to give me some feedback, because I will do this talk in the future. You can also write on JoinedIn if you didn't find a bug. Shortly about me, I work at happier.com. I do a lot of Symfony stuff. I run PHP meetups in Stockholm, and I'm doing a lot of open source. I started my real open source career in 2015 in Paris. PSR6 just came out, about the one about caching. And me and my friend like, hey, let's write adapters for Doctrine cache to PSR. So we started doing that one night, and then we're like, hey, why don't we implement the caching as well? So that's what we did. We created PHP cache, we had some bundles. At the same time, I was doing HTTP plug, which is an abstraction over HTTP client, like Guzzle and Buzz. The goal was to not have the Guzzle 5.6 issue anymore. And when you do a lot of HTTP clients, you do a lot of API clients and a lot of mail clients, and I wrote a specification how you make the best API client there is. And nowadays I'm maintainer of both Guzzle and Buzz. And I'm writing a PSR7 implementation. I'm writing a PSR about HTTP clients. I do some testing things. I do some geocoding things, and a lot more. My very favorite library is the NSA one. With NSA, you totally violate class privacy. So accessing private properties or private methods is super easy with NSA. So let's get started. Let's bring you back in 2013. I was working at Happier. I have been developing Symfony for like 4 years at this time. And I really like the Symfony framework. The Symfony framework was the best thing ever. And that's also the first framework I ever encountered. But I loved everything that had Symfony in the name. And Symfony had a concept of bundles, which I obviously did enjoy. So I had the strategy, when I created my app, I created bundles for everything. In my application, I maybe have 20, 30, 40 different bundles, and they were packed together in a reusable way, because I would reuse this in a later time or in a later project. And as you may know, a bundle is full of different things. You have commands, you have controllers, you have translation files, you have configuration, you even have views and JavaScript and CSS in a bundle. And there's also a lot of magic here in the bundle. Do you know, at this time, there was Symfony 2 something something. And do you know how you made a command be automatically registered as a command? You had to put it in a command folder and name the class something command. If you didn't, it didn't get picked up. So it's a lot of magic here. And this was my general controller. This is an import controller that's just a batch import of something. And it's just one endpoint, and it's hundreds of lines of code. And if I needed this in a CLI, if I did a batch import to CLI, I just copied the code from the controller to my command. And obviously there wasn't we laugh about this now, but back then I was pretty happy about myself. I was pretty happy with this. I was the Symfony expert. I consider myself as a Symfony expert, and I had no problem maintaining this code. And sure, we had a CEO/developer that time. He had problem maintaining it, but I thought yes, that's just because he doesn't know Symfony very well. Is the question already? It's intentional. Thank you, though. Yeah, thank you. I knew I could improve in my code, but I didn't really know how. And people saying like, hey, let's make it more testable. And people on Twitter like, hey, you should test your controllers. Register as a service and test your controllers. And I'm like, I'm not even testing my code. Why should I test my controllers? I didn't really understand the concept here. But I felt like you should, I mean, since people are saying you should register controls as services, I felt like I should use more services. I shouldn't write this big fat controls anymore. So I started creating services for everything. And as you may know, when you're creating a Symfony controller, that's kind of a sweet spot to write your code. It's a lot of conveniences in a controller. I mean, first you have direct access to the container, and you have like this is granted or this get user, and you have this render, and a lot of nice thing in the controller that you didn't have in a service. So I was trying to have this all Symfony, magic, nice things in my services as well. So I created something called a current user provider service. And so I can inject my current user object into any service, which is nice if you write logs or whatever. And I actually thought this was such a good idea, so I wanted to bring this into Symfony Core. And when I posted this pull request, people were saying like I was doing things wrong somehow. Didn't quite understand. They say I should send the user as a function parameter instead of injecting it as a service. So I didn't quite understand. I felt like I was wrong doing this, but I could improve somehow. So I started to realize that having Symfony all over the place wasn't a good idea. I mean, I shouldn't have this Symfony magic everywhere in my code. And at the same time, this guy was touring Europe. He was talking about when to framework. And he gave me so much inspiration. I mean, I've read and listened to Matthias plenty of time, and he gave me so much inspiration. And he told me, or he told the audience, like you should use something called hexagonal design or hexagonal architecture. And this is one thing I'll like to share with you quickly today. What it basically means that you should keep your kernel, or you should keep your core of application, you should keep that away from the infrastructure. And then you let the framework handle the infrastructure. And the infrastructure layer like talks to the outside world, talks with HTTP, and then creates some messages. And then send those messages to my core. Make sense? Are these news? I mean, do you kind of know this? Or do you use this thing? Excellent. So I decided to create a lot of messages. I call them commands, and I have a lot of command handlers. And what I really want to do, the only thing my controller did, it took HTTP and converted that to a message and put the message on the bus. And the bus somehow found the handler and started to execute the handler. And this really makes the bus the bus was like a boundary from the real world to my application. And if I want to do a Symfony command, I just took the input from the CLI and just wrote a command from that and gave it to the bus. Same thing if I was watching the file system for file system changes, I just took the changes and created a command and gave it to my core. So the only thing that communicated with my core was the commands, and my core was not connected to Symfony. It was not connected to anything else. It was just written in pure PHP that I've written myself. And the first time I really got a proof that this was a good idea was it was 2016. I got an intern, and the intern knew Laravel. I mean, he was a Laravel guy, and he was quite scared to join our company because we were a Symfony company. We loved Symfony, and I was a Symfony guy. I mean, how can a Laravel guy work with a Symfony guy? He was anxious before I started. But a few weeks into this, he realized that I'm not even using Symfony. I'm just using application code. So he felt like, oh, this is nice because I'm actually understanding the code I'm writing because it's just PHP. So this was a quick brief of hexagonal design. If you talk to an expert on this, they would probably say that, hey, you have to have rules that you can't depend on the database or you can't depend on here and there. I mean, this was just the gist, and this is the only thing I'm using. I'm not really, rules is not really important. So here's some references. I mean, just Google hexagonal design and you find plenty from Matthias Noback and other smart people. So, but the question we should ask ourselves, what did we really win by this? I mean, why couldn't the controller just call the command handler directly? Why do we need a bus? It wasn't really, it was more of a rhetorical question. Thank you for playing though. My answer is middlewares. We can now use middlewares. So if we have a bus that's the only, if every message to our application core goes via by a bus, we can add middlewares here. Say middlewares for logging, or middlewares for validating that the messages are in the format we expect. Or we can have, like, if something goes wrong, we can have a middleware that rolls back the doctrine transactions. So you don't have you don't have the database in an unknown state. Also, you can have a middlewares for queues. So let's talk about queues. You know the queue, the data structure from the intro, and I'm not going to talk about data structure. I'm going to talk about queues as a service, pretty much. And I was using queues for a while, and then I got introduced to different queuing strategies. So I feel it's a good thing to repeat them. This is a normal work queue. You have one producer that produces messages or produces tasks that you should do, and then you have one or more consumers that consumes those messages. And if you notice that your queue gets longer and longer, you can just slap on more consumers. So instead of fixing and improving your algorithms for printing PDFs or whatever, you can just slap on more consumers. This is simple. This is what most people is doing. You could do something called fan out. So you're talking to one exchange, and then the exchange is putting your messages on different queues. So say in this example, say maybe consumer A is the one who sends emails and consumer B is the one who creates PDFs. So if consumer B goes down, you don't want the messages to disappear, right? You want the messages to be stacked on the queue. So this is where you use a fan out. You could also be a little bit more sophisticated. You're talking to exchange, and the exchange decide what queue your message should go to, and you use a routing key. Moving too fast or too slow? It's okay.
Is that rhetorical?
When you're having this fan out, this routing approach, it's also fine to do something like this, to have the same queue to go, same key to go to different queues. This is basically the same as fan out. Or if you want to be even more sophisticated, you could use topics. So say that we have queues for log messages, and we have topics for your application and the firewall. And so you create your topics with a pattern like the top left here. So you have app notice or app error or firewall notice or whatever. So you can say that consumer A is only interested in errors, no matter which part of the application that dispatches this. And consumer B is only interested in things from the application, no matter which severity it is. So let's see some code here. Let's leave 2013 and let's move on to how we should work with this today. And since I'm a Symfony guy, I would like to talk about the messenger component. There are a few others. There are Tactican and there are Simple Bus. They work pretty much the same. Messenger components is pretty much Simple Bus with a flawless integration with Symfony. That's the only difference in my opinion. So let's consider this again, and let's consider the different annotation. We don't care who creates the message. We just have a message that we put on a bus, and the bus is delivered to a message handler. So a message is just a normal class. This is a message for sending the notification. Just a normal class with a normal constructor and some normal getters. In my controller, if I want to create this message, I get some input from the request, get some input from HTTP, use that and create my message. And then I use the bus to dispatch my message. And if I run this controller, I will get a page like this. Symfony is nice enough to tell me, hey, you have not created a handler for this message yet. So let's look at the handler. A handler is just a normal class. Doesn't implement anything, doesn't extend anything, just a normal class. It has an invoke method, so you can use this class as a callable. And in this specific case, I said I want to have a send notification message, and then I just send notifications to all the users there. And here I'm echoing out the message. And then I register this class with in the services YAML. I could do, this is two examples. I could do at the top, you register one at a time, or I could use the globe pattern that you see at the bottom. And the important thing is to slap on the messenger.message handler tag. And with that tag, Symfony figures out what messages you really subscribes to and does it automatically for you. So when I run my, everything okay? Okay. So when I run my controller again, I get an output like this. It prints the message and says everything else okay. But what if the messages takes a bit longer time to send? What if this, or to consume? What if I want to do things asynchronously? Then I add something called a transport to do things asynchronously. And I think I put the message on the queue. The bus is putting in the transport, and the worker sometimes receive it. And then I dispatch it. And it goes to the message handler. So the definition of a transport, I mean, a transport is not a made-up word. It's actually used in other context. A transport has a sender and a receiver. A transport could be configured via a DSN, and you obviously can't really do much with a PHP object if you want to transport it somewhere. So you have to encode or decode it somehow. And by default, we're using the Symfony serializer. I mean, you can use any serializer you want, like a JSON serializer. So if you want to configure the messenger component to do async, we have to say we want to use a transport. We name it default, and here is the DSN. And the DSN is like, I put it in my environment file. And you see I use the AMQP protocol or schema here, which says that I'm using the AMQP transport pretty much. And then I'm saying I gotta configure routing. I say this send notification message is gonna go with the default transport. And so when I run the controller, I just get an OK, because I haven't done anything yet, right? I mean, I just put something on the queue and I printed OK. So how do we consume this? We basically just run the messenger consume messages command, and it will run forever. This is a while through loop that continuously consumes messages from the queue. And this is, I mean, you shouldn't run PHP for a very long time, so this is not always preferred. So there are like things you can limit this command with. You can say you should only consume 100 messages, or you should only run for 5 minutes, and then you use something like supervisor to make sure it runs forever, or goes up and down and runs forever. So I have another animation for you. A transport, the transport you probably will use the most is RabbitMQ. It's super popular when you're doing PHP, but however you can use any transport. The AMQP transport, RabbitMQ is a queue that implements the AMQP protocol. So the Symfony default transport, or the one that's shipped with the component, is an AMQP transport that could talk with any queue talking AMQP. And if you want to do something more fancy, say you want to use SQS by Amazon, or you want to use Google PubSub, you can easily do that. The thing that I really like about this, I'm not sure, I'm maybe the only one who's excited by this, but the messenger component is only about buses and messages. Having a transport, it's just a implementation detail. It's just a bonus thing that most people are doing, but it's just a bonus thing. So it's messenger component is not about queues at all. So if you want to use something more fancy than RabbitMQ, there is a awesome organization called PHP that has adapters for all major transports. So if you want to use Kafka or Redis or whatever, you just install that bundle and it integrates smoothly with the messenger component. So what I do like here is that your code or your messaging component lives in the one app, talks to RabbitMQ or another transport, and you have another app that could be Symfony. It could be this very same code base, could be a different code base, could be a different machine, it could be a different language, or it could be a different team of developers developing this. And so you configure Symfony to put the message on the bus, and then it puts on the RabbitMQ, and then eventually, at some time, an application reads it and dispatches it to its message handlers. And depending on your configuration, you can have another message that you put on the bus and it goes in the queue. But here, you have configured this message to go back to the first application to be consumed on its message handlers. And there is nothing is opinionated here. I mean, this is so flexible, you can do whatever you like. It's just how you configure it or how you relate to this. So if you want to configure like PHP-enqueue, you just add another transport and you add another DSN here. And then you say that your send notification message should use both these transports, or just one transport, or no transports. You decide yourself. And you may think this looks weird. I have the acme here. I have the enqueue://acme. And that's actually a reference to the PHP-enqueue configuration. So that's a reference to their bundle configuration. So I just want to stress this again. If you have like a complex queue setup where you're using different topics and you have multiple consumers and subscribers, this app 2 doesn't really care. This app 2 only reads from the queue. It doesn't need to know how your exchanges are looking like or how your exchange is configured. I'm a big fan of CQRS. CQRS is a command query responsibility segregation or separation. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm a big fan. It basically means that you have commands that does something or do something, and you have queries that fetches data. And I'm also a big fan of actions and reactions. So I want to have commands that do actions, and I want to have events that react to something that already happened. So I need multiple buses to support this. And these buses have different constraints, or they work in different ways. A command has one-to-one mapping to a command handler. A query has to return something, and an event has 0 or more subscribers. So how would I implement this in Messenger component? I'll just define my buses like this. Here's some service IDs, and here's my buses. Now I have three buses. And of course, I could enforce my rules by adding middlewares. I just say that, hey, there's a command bus. It has to have exactly one handler. And I want to use validation. And maybe since the command bus is actually making changes to my application, I may want to have a custom middleware that tells my event sourcing system that something happened. And all the other buses, I mean, they're pretty similar. I mean, the event bus, I configured that I allow no handler with that one. So this is how I configure multiple buses. And one thing I learned, I learned a few weeks ago, when you type hinting, you use Symfony Autowire, and when you type hinting for a messenger bus interface, since you have 3 implementations, you don't really know which one you get, right? So here we have we define a default bus to be the command bus. But if you are using some trickery in your service declaration, you could bind variable names with the services. And I didn't know about this, and this is awesome because now you can Autowire everything. Also, did you know about this? Not rhetorical. Oh, that's excellent. Everybody knew. Anyhow, I'm happy to show you.
So how do you use it? It's like you type in it with the interface and then you name the variable or the parameter command plus, it will automatically inject the command.
Yes, so if I use a service, I use type it with the interface, and then if I want the query bus, I use the variable name as query bus. So it works flawlessly. It's still some magic that I want to go away from, but this, I mean, you created this magic yourself. So the question was, if you are a group of developers, and only one of them created this, and the other one doesn't know, how do they know which bus they get?
Yeah, but when suddenly they use the same name and it can go from it.
So yeah, you will have a problem if you were expecting an event bus, and you name your variable a command bus, then you will actually get the command bus. And you will get some errors because your middleware tells you that, hey, you have to have exactly one handler. And yes, that's dangerous. If you don't want to use this magic, don't use Outlier. Just define all your services in the normal way. And you will have service declarations that are thousands of lines. But that's, I mean, sure, that's a risk. I want to show you a query handler. It's just a normal PHP class again. And it doesn't do anything fancy. I mean, I have to do a better way to fetch the users. But the only difference between this handler and other handlers is that this handler actually have a return statement. So you can actually return things through the bus, and it will work its way back to the one who dispatches the event. In fact, all handlers and all messages are exactly the same. It's just the way how you relate to them. One pattern I use a lot is this pattern. Here's my send message handler again. So I send all the messages, and then I want to tell the world like, hey, notifications are sent. So I dispatch a command. Oh, sorry, I dispatch an event saying that. So this is great when I create a user, or a user signed up. Then in my user sign up handler, I dispatch an event saying user was signed up. And then I have event subscribers listening to that event to send the user a welcome message, or whatever you need to do with new users. One topic, I mean, this is all nice and easy, but how do you handle failures? I mean, this is where the tricky things comes. I mean, you have to have a strategy, and no strategy is the best strategy. It always depends on your use case. So the default strategy that could be best for most or good for most is that when you have this message that goes on the bus, goes by the transport to the queue, and eventually get received by worker, and then it goes to the handler, and you get an error. It's actually the responsibility of the transport to figure out what to do next. The default transport is quite nice. It just requeues the message and try it again at a later time, which seems fine as a default action. If you're using PHP enqueue, you could be a little bit more sophisticated. You could definitely configure it to only requeue it 5 times. And the first time you wait 60 seconds, and after that you wait 5 minutes, and then you wait 10 minutes. So you actually have a back-off strategy. I'm using something different. I'm make sure that if a message fail, I put it on a fail queue, and I shuffle all the messages from my fail queue to my real queue like once every hour, once every second hour. And I hope that I've fixed the error until the message is rerun. And at least, I mean, if a message fails over and over, I'll get some huge error logs, and I'm eventually gonna fix the issue. And since this is asynchronously, I mean, I don't really care about when the message is handled. I just want to make sure it's handled eventually. So it's fine if it takes a day or two. Obviously, it depends on your use case, but for me, it's fine if it takes a day or two. And one cool thing here is also, when the transporter handles your message, it goes back to the message bus, and the other middlewares are being executed with the exception, obviously. So you have the doctrine middleware that makes sure that to roll back your doctrine transaction when an error exception happened. I had a. Okay, so thought something would happen. Say you're building an API, and you want to have a create user action. So you want to create a user, and then when the user is created, you want to say, hey, go to this page to see the new user. And in that page, that new URL obviously includes the user ID. So how can you get the user ID if the command doesn't return anything? You get the problem? Did you get the problem?
Yes.
I heard some no. So basically, you want to create a user and then go to this user API/user ID URL to see the new user. But if you're dispatching a user command to create a new user, you don't get anything returned. So you don't know the ID of the new user. So how do you generate the URL to show to your client? And the answer is you use UUIDs. And you add this to the command. This is my create user command. It only takes a username and a UID. And my controller is creating a new UID and then gives the command. And I trust my handler to use that UID for the new user. So now I can easily just do something like this. So I blindly trust that a new user object is created with this UID. If it wasn't created, obviously it would throw an exception here, and I would handle the exception somehow. So this is how I can redirect my users to a new endpoint. And I don't know if you noticed, but I snuck in some annotations here. This is my command. And this is how I can using only these annotations, I can validate my message in the bus already. So my handlers doesn't need to validate my message. And by using this, I can actually enforce that all usernames has at least 3 characters. And this logic, I don't have to put this logic in my command handler. I hope I'm giving you like an overview of a architecture, and I hope I told you about queues and how to use queues, and I told you a bit how to use buses. I don't have much more slides. Do you have any questions to this? One question at the back. Yes? Ooh, so how can I roll back a transaction that is starting in a different thread? So you're saying that, oh, okay. So you're talking about if I'm gonna repeat it. I don't know if everybody called it. If I'm gonna send money to you, you have one event sending money, and another event decreasing my account, another event increasing your account, and you're saying if the third or second event fails, I roll back the transaction, I said. And in this specific scenario, you should obviously have those actions autonomous, or else you may be creating money by mistake. But I'm talking about rolling back the actual database transaction from one event. And if we were not doing it autonomously, so I was using 3 events. If the second event failed, we roll back the transaction that the second event may or may not have started, and then we put it on the error queue, and at a later point we continue this transaction back and forth. So I'm not rolling back the first event's transaction. Another great question would be, what if you have the you saw I'm using validation, and what if you're having validation groups? You don't want to use the default validation groups or with serializing groups or whatever. So I actually wasn't too honest with you. We actually use something called an envelope. So you put your message in an envelope, and then you put it on the bus. And in fact, on this envelope, you'll write like which validation groups you should using, or maybe which strategy to retry the message and stuff. And then when you'll see what happened. And the thing here is that you don't need to know of the envelope. If you're writing your own middlewares, you would never see the envelope unless you implement some interface. So, but there is ways to send some metadata with the message. I had one question at the back. If I know if it's possible to make a query to RabbitMQ. Oh, to fetch data with async queries. Are you talking about like acknowledging messages? So what you basically do with RabbitMQ, you say that I want 50 messages, you say, and you get 50 messages reserved for you. Then you process them one by one, and you acknowledge that this message is processed. So just because you say I want 50 messages doesn't mean you take 50 messages off the queue. So that's how you kind of query RabbitMQ, and that's all the responsibility of the transport. And if you don't like the default one, just use a special one. I actually saw one guy last week. He was writing his custom transport by using a file system. So instead of using RabbitMQ, he stored things on a file. So I kind of answered your question. We can talk more about it later if you want. Do you have a question here? Yeah. Why do you use a command when I publish my message?
Yeah, because
you're talking about the CLI command?
no, in your controller, the command that goes on the bus.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just as well just publish the message directly on the queue using a publish.
Oh yeah, I could, but it's not. Then I'm not using the bus, so I miss out all the glorious middlewares, and I'm not sure I wanted to put every message on the queue. I have like 20% of all my messages in my application. I put them asynchronously, and the other 80% I'm executing directly. But I want to have the bus as a separation from the between my interface and my application core. Last question.
The envelope?
The envelope, yeah.
Was that part of the messenger component or something you wrote?
The envelope is part of messenger component. It was not in the initial pull request, but it has been added like a month ago. I'm not sure if you noticed, but the messenger component just got released as a component with Symfony 4.1 and was marked as experimental, which means that API could change. We don't follow the Symfony BC promise, but the reason is that there's only like me and 4 other developers using this component at the moment. So I will encourage the community to use it and try to break it and see what works for you or not. And then maybe we'll introduce a slight BC break in November when we're releasing 4.2. This is how Symfony introduces new components nowadays. I hope you liked my talk. I hope you learned something from it. And I said this is the first time I'm giving this talk, so please give me some feedback. I mean, things you thought were missing, or things you thought I was going too slow or too fast. Any feedback will be excellent and really appreciated. Thank you for your attention. See you at the coding night tonight.